Preparations are in full swing for the historic summit.
I think what is really important is you've got reaffirmation from the very top of the North Korean government that they want this summit to take place.
Even if has been an agreement to proceed with the summit, there still are a lot of unknowns and there still are risks.
An important part of his mission, reporting back to Kim Jong-un, what kind of a man am I going to sit down with in Singapore?
I don't know if there's a good chance of success, but I think it's important to test the North Koreans who we understand are interested in a new process.
From the Voice of America, this is Washington Talk.
Hello and welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun-jang Cho. Preparations are in full swing for the historic summit between President Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. The U.S. moved on several fronts and held talks in Singapore, in the demilitarized zone, and in New York. Chairman Kim Jong-un also sent a letter to President Trump, delivered by his top aide.
We'll be meeting on June 12th in Singapore.
We made progress here. Make no mistake about it, there remains a great deal of work to do.
Now my guest today, Mr. Frank Jannuzi, president of the Mansfield Foundation and former advisor to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Also joining us today, Ambassador James Zumwalt, CEO of the Sasakawa Peace Foundation, USA. During his 36-year foreign service career, Ambassador Zumwalt focused on Asia and served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Japanese and Korean Affairs. Welcome to the program.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. Ambassador, let me begin with you. What is symbolic about Kim Jong-un's top aide bringing letter to Washington, D.C.?
I think it's very important prior to a meeting between two nations' leaders to have very intensive engagement at all levels of government. But I see it as a positive sign that the Korean leader is sending this kind of a message to our president.
Mm-hmm.
You know, 6 years ago, when the current Vice Foreign Minister, Ri Yong-ho, visited New York, he also brought messages, not in the form of a letter, but in the form of oral presentation to be shared with senior U.S. officials from Kim Jong-un at the time of the Leap Day agreement. Now that agreement ultimately collapsed, but I think what is really important is you've got reaffirmation from the very top of the North Korean government that they want this summit to take place. So they are working for success, not for failure.
Mm-hmm. So, Mr. Jannuzi, now that we have the date and we are good to go with the original plan, does this mean the United States and North Korea have narrowed their big differences?
It would appear that the two nations, through their representatives, have at least agreed the top-line commitments on denuclearization and peace, and that they've more or less agreed on a definition of denuclearization and what kind of peace will follow. But I would caution people to remember that a summit like this is not 100% until they actually sit down. Mm-hmm. And even when they sit down, the summit could nonetheless end in failure. So this is a good step. It makes the likelihood of Singapore meeting happening much, much greater, but there is still uncertainty and risk associated with this meeting.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador, does this mean the groundwork has been laid solidly?
I would not say the groundwork has been laid solidly. I agree with Frank that even if has been an agreement to proceed with the summit, there still are a lot of unknowns and there still are risks, but there also is hope, and so we can hope for a positive outcome.
Ambassador, there have been 3 parallel preparatory talks. Why did the United States push in multiple channels this week?
I think prior to a summit meeting, it's very normal for the two governments to engage at various levels. What's different this time is perhaps that this process has been compressed into a very short period of time, so some of this has occurred simultaneously. But Joe Hagan in Singapore is focusing on logistics, and there are a lot of issues to work out. I mean, just one example is both leaders have security forces, so how do they coordinate in terms of accomplishing their jobs of protecting their leader. I think the team that is in Seoul from the United States, led by Ambassador Sung Kim, is an incredibly experienced and capable team, and I'm sure they're talking with counterparts about various substantive issues, including perhaps what would emerge in a joint statement or some kind of an agreement. But the most important meetings, of course, are the ones occurring yesterday in New York and today in Washington, with a senior North Korean leader coming to the United States, meeting with Secretary Pompeo.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Jannuzi, Secretary Pompeo said that there was big progress this week. Do you think the two sides narrow their gap in the concept of denuclearization?
Well, I do think there are two major top-line issues that have to be nailed down. One is the definition of denuclearization and making sure that when North Korea pledges that they want to live on a denuclearized peninsula, that everyone understands what it means and that the North and the Americans have the same definition of what it means. The other is defining peace. That may seem strange to talk about how do you define peace. I mean, but it's more than just the absence of war. Peace may or may not mean complete economic normalization. Peace may or may not mean a peace treaty. It might be some other form of a peace declaration or a peace mechanism. So I think Pompeo and Kim Yong-chol are focused on these top-line issues that must be agreed if a summit is going to proceed. I think if they cannot nail that down, then the summit could be delayed. All of the rest of it is also important, the details about the phasing or the sequencing and reciprocal steps, but that is something that can be negotiated in the months to come. But they need to get these first two issues narrowed in advance of the summit.
Ambassador, the United States and North Korea have wide gap in terms of denuclearization. U.S. wants quick process, whereas North Korea wants phased process. So how can the two sides find common ground?
Now, that's a very good question. I think realistically it will be very difficult to achieve quick denuclearization. North Korea has an incredibly large and complex program. At the nuclear site at Yongbyon, for example, there are over 300 buildings that would need to be inspected. So I don't think it's realistic to think that complete denuclearization can occur in a short period of time. However, you could see a phased process that is more front-loaded, so there's more visible progress early on in the process. So that's one possible way of bridging this gap.
And Ambassador, there were reports that the advance team discussed North Korea handing over nuclear material and nuclear weapons early in the process. Is this any meaningful?
I think some concrete gesture that's meaningful will be very important to the United States, given that complete denuclearization in a short period of time is probably not possible. So some concrete steps that are seen as meaningful in the form of a good faith gesture from North Korea, I think is very important.
Just building on this, I mean, I think that Trump wants to accomplish something that previous denuclearization agreements did not. And previous ones were all built on this phased, reciprocal, step-by-step process, but they never reached the point of North Korea handing over any fissile material. So I think this could be a very important measurement, not only for President Trump, but really for the international community in trying to assess whether or not North Korea is serious. The Iran nuclear deal, interestingly, required Iran to hand over 95% of their highly enriched uranium up front. And so one option that may be on the table here in discussions with North Korea is, are they willing to hand over non-weaponized, highly enriched fissile material, highly enriched uranium, in the front end of any deal? And I think politically for Trump, you know, if he cannot achieve the Iran standard, then it's a little bit awkward because he has criticized the Iran deal as being not good enough. So if his North Korea deal is not even as good as the Iran deal, then he may have some political liability.
And Ambassador Zumwalt, South Korean President Moon Jae-in claims to be a mediator between North Korea and the United States. And just last week, he was, rushed to meet with Kim Jong-un for the second time. How can President Moon be a good mediator, but be a good ally at the same time?
Korean people have a lot of interest, and so of course South Korea needs to be at the center of a multilateral process. But I don't think being at the center means mediating. I would say being a catalyst, being a cheerleader, encouraging, maybe even mentoring, those are all appropriate roles but mediator implies that somehow our alliance has been forgotten. And so I would encourage people not to see Korea as a mediator, but rather as a facilitator of the bilateral process that President Trump and Kim Jong-un, we hope, will engage in.
And Mr. Jannuzi, President Moon wants to hold a trilateral right after the U.S.-North Korea summit to discuss ending the Korean War. What is the important consideration for the United States in ending the Korean War?
Well, I think some kind of a declaratory peace early in the process, if it is accompanied by an ironclad commitment from the North to denuclearization, creates a whole different negotiating environment for the months to come. If the parties are still technically sort of in a state of war, then I think all of that tough bargaining that takes place after this summit takes place under that cloud of suspicion. So it's not a bad idea, but I think the mechanics of this may prove to be more daunting than people expect. Not only do you have the issue of China, which obviously, I mean, China has to be ultimately involved in any peace mechanism. They were one of the signers of the armistice. But you also just have the questions about how authoritative the peace mechanism should be.
Ambassador Zumwalt, is there also a role of U.S. Congress in this peace agreement?
Yes, there's a very important role for the U.S. Congress, and I think going forward, it'll be very important for the Trump administration to engage Congress, particularly the Senate, to make sure that the Congress is comfortable with the steps that President Trump plans to implement. Because there are ways, if the Congress is unhappy, that Congress could interfere with or stymie some initiatives. So we have a democratic government with the separation of powers, and it's important for the North Koreans and others to recognize that while President Trump is our president, there are other players who are also very important.
President Trump threw out the conventional diplomatic playbook. Is there a good chance of success here?
I don't know if there's a good chance of success, but I think it's important to test the North Koreans who we understand are interested in a new process. As a former government official, I can say that certainly I was surprised by President Trump and frankly very skeptical that this would be successful. But I think as professional diplomats, people who work in the Defense Department and the CIA and the White House, now our political elected officials have made a decision, and so the role of government officials now is to help that person be successful. And so I think the U.S. government has swung into action doing everything it can to support the president.
We'll end this conversation here and watch video for our next discussion. General Kim Young-chul, one of Chairman Kim's closest aides, is the highest-ranking North Korean official to visit the United States in 18 years. He met with Secretary Pompeo to finalize plans for the summit and brought Chairman Kim's letter to President Trump. Now, Ambassador, what do you think is Kim Young-chul's main purpose of coming to the United States?
I certainly can't speculate and don't want to speak for him, but I'm sure the North Korean side wants to feel out U.S. intentions and what it is that the U.S. Is hoping to achieve in this summit. And I'm sure he will go back with a recommendation whether it's possible to proceed or not. So in some ways, I think his purpose is the same as Secretary Pompeo's, is there's still a lot of undone issues, things that need to be discussed. And having a summit does pose an element of risk for both sides. And so trying to reduce that element of risk, I suspect, is his goal.
And Mr. Jannuzi, what was Vice Chairman Kim Young-chul's role in the overall U.S.-North Korea interactions this year?
He's played a critical role, not only in his capacity as an intelligence chief, but also in his role as a senior advisor to Kim Jong-un on even North-South relations. So he has become the highest level interlocutor. But I think his role here in D.C. is one that is also, in addition to the points that Jim made, he's also hoping to meet with President Trump. And have a chance for the first time to have a senior North Korean official lay eyes on President Trump and look at his character, look at the way he behaves, look at the way he speaks, how does he interact with others. Pompeo has had 2 of those opportunities with Kim Jong-un. He has the opportunity to brief President Trump on what kind of a person Kim Jong-un is. But this will be the first chance, potentially, for a senior North Korean official to have a meeting with President Trump himself. And I think that that may be an important part of his mission, reporting back to Kim Jong-un, what kind of a man am I going to sit down with in Singapore?
And Mr. Jannuzi, Vice Chairman Kim Young-chul is on both sanctions list of South Korea and the United States. What is telling about this character?
Well, look, this is a guy who either directly or indirectly was responsible for everything from the Cheonan torpedo attack, as your segment pointed out, to the shelling of Yeonpyeong Island, and possibly involved in the assassination of Kim Jong-nam. So there is blood on his hands, either through his direct actions or through his failure to prevent these war crimes. But the United States doesn't have the luxury of telling North Korea who to send us as an envoy. Diplomats deal with these kinds of issues all the time. I think that the United States rightly is going to treat him with respect because he is the authoritative voice of the DPRK today in Washington, D.C.
And Ambassador,
if I could just add, I agree with what Frank said, but I think it's also important for the U.S. side not to forget who he is and what his background is and what kind of a person he is.
And Ambassador Zumwalt, how can you compare Vice Chairman Kim Young-chul's trip to the United States to, back in 2000, Vice Marshal Cho Myung-ruk's visit to the White House?
I think there's some similarities and some differences, and the biggest difference is the difference between President Clinton back in 2000 and President Trump today. President Clinton was hopeful that there could be a summit with North Korea's leader, but he deferred to Secretary Albright and to the other folks to engage to see whether it was possible for him to come. And ultimately, Secretary Albright, after her trip to Pyongyang, advised that it wasn't a good time to have that meeting. I think in this case with President Trump, it's the opposite. He decided to have a meeting, and now people like Secretary Pompeo are trying to make sure that the parameters for the meeting are set. So that's the biggest difference between these two.
Well, we'll end this conversation here and move on to our next segment. Now, time for the photo moment, a time to look at an interesting North Korea picture. Now, we're trying something different today. Let's take a listen to this audio clip.
Laurel, Laurel, Laurel.
Frank, do you hear Yanni or Laurel?
I hear Laurel, and boy, you know, when you think about North Korea, go ahead. What do you hear?
Ambassador?
I hear Laurel as well.
You do? Well, we have the photo today here based on this viral audio clip on the internet that has sparked a big discussion on the internet. And this picture is on this audio clip. And the picture shows Chairman Kim Jong-un, here's Yanni, and President Trump, here's Laurel, and Ambassador Bolton, here's Libya. Now, Frank, what is your reaction to this picture?
Well, you know, I don't think anyone looks at North Korea without some kind of a lens on. In my case, it's trifocals. But I think that for sure, people bring a lot to the challenge of trying to understand what North Korea is all about and where we should be going. And we better try to get closer than this, because if this is where we are with 3 distinct points of view, we're heading for a train wreck.
Ambassador?
No, I think it's a very funny cartoon because it shows how 2 leaders listening to the same sound can hear very different things. So I certainly hope that won't be the case if President Trump and Kim Jong-un do meet.
Well, on that note, we'll end this discussion here. Ambassador, Frank, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. And this was Washington Talk from the Voice of America, and I'm Eun Jang Cho. Join us next week for more analysis on North Korea.